Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program for Monday, August 16th. The program is titled Aztec Codices, an introduction to their form and contents. It is a live online presentation by Lori Bornasian-Deal. She's the professor of art history at Texas Christian University. And we're going to be getting started in just a minute or so. We're letting folks in from the waiting room right now. So just sit back, relax, and be patient. We will be starting in a minute or two. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. If you've just joined us and you're here for the Book Club's live online program titled Aztec Codices, an introduction to their form and contents, well, you're in the right place. We're just letting in participants from the waiting room right now. We will be getting started in a minute or so, so please just sit back, relax, and be patient. We will be starting in just a moment. Thank you. So it's a few minutes past the top of the hour, and we have quite a number of people registered for this presentation. So we're going to get started and let people join us while we're in progress. So good evening, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program titled Aztec Codices, an introduction to their form and contents. It is a live online presentation by Lori Bornasian-Deal, professor of art history at Texas Christian University. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the executive director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host this webinar. Tonight, we do have more than 200 people registered for this presentation. So for those of you who are new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do this with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We also host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, history, and much, much more. So if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many. And we simply cannot do the work that we do without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or donate to the Book Club of California. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. The program is titled Aztec Codices, an introduction to their form and contents. And it is a live online presentation by Lori Bornasian-Deal. Lori Bornasian-Deal is a PhD. She is the professor of art history at Texas Christian University, where she teaches courses on the art of the ancient Americas and colonial Latin American art. Her research focuses on Aztec codices created after the conquest. She has published 2 books, the Codex Mexicanos, a guide to life in late 16th century New Spain, which was published in 2018, and the Tierra De Tapeshpond, negotiating place under Aztec and Spanish rule, published in 2008, both with the University of Texas Press. And another book titled Aztec Codices, What They Tell Us About Daily Life, with ABC Clio, published in 2020. Her book on the Codex Mexicanus won the Roland H. Bainton Prize in Art and Music History from the 16th Century Studies Conference. She has also published a number of scholarly articles and essays focused on Aztec pictorial manuscripts and the role of women in Aztec history. Her latest project considers the experiences of women during the Spanish conquest of Mexico. She has also received fellowships from the Dumbarton Oaks Research Library and Collection and the Wenner Gren Foundation. Tonight, she will be talking about Aztec books, which are often called codices. And these are not the inflexible bound books typical of Europe. Instead, Aztec books were made of long sheets of paper, of deer hide or bark fiber that were coated with gesso and then painted and folded accordion style. Lori will be giving us all an introduction to these Aztec codices, explaining their pictorial system of writing, the material form of the books, and their varied contents. Now, if you have any questions for our presenter, please use the chat and the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have time at the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those from the Q&A, okay? So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Lori Bornasian-Deal, and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. Lori, it's all yours.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you all for having me and for such a great turnout. I didn't think about the timing of this when we set it up, but it's rather fitting to be presenting to you today, as this past Friday marked the 500-year anniversary of the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, when on August 13th, 1521, the last Aztec ruler, Cuauhtemoc, surrendered to Hernán Cortés. The Aztecs are probably better known for their sculptural tradition, better known for the sculptures than their books. Sculpted from the rough basalt stone that was common in the area, their most impressive works, such as the calendar stone and Coatlicue that I show you here, are monumental in scale. They were made in Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztec Empire. However, the inhabitants of this city did not call themselves Aztecs, but rather Mashika. And they used public sculptures like this to send messages about their ability to keep the gods happy and maintain the empire. Upon the conquest, the Spaniards hid these works, fearing the messages they sent, but their sheer size made them difficult to destroy, unlike Aztec painted books. The painted manuscript tradition is more difficult to speak about because only about a dozen pre-conquest manuscripts survived destruction by Spaniards during and after the conquest. The manuscript I'm showing you here, known as the Codex Borbonicus, is one of the few to be associated with the Mashika of Tenochtitlan. But whether or not this work was created before or after the conquest is still debated. Notice the extra spaces in the boxes, which seem to have been left for Spanish annotations and suggest this was a post-conquest work. However, the style and medium, being painted with native pigments on native bark paper, point to it still being painted by Mashika artists, unacculturated by the more illusionistic painting style introduced by the Spaniards. The few Aztec manuscripts that survived the conquest are all religious in nature and most likely not made in Tenochtitlan, but in cities under Aztec control. The one I show you here is known as the Codex Borgia. It's a screenfold manuscript painted on deer skin that had been treated and made into paper, then covered in gesso and painted. This particular one is owned by the Vatican, while the Codex Borbonicus I showed you before is owned by the Library of the National Assembly in Paris. In fact, most of the known pre-conquest divinatory manuscripts are owned by European institutions. They were most likely sent to Europe during or soon after the conquest as items of curiosity. Unfortunately, the hundreds of other manuscripts that must have been in existence at the time of the Spanish conquest were destroyed by the Spaniards. This 16th century illustration shows Spanish friars burning Aztec idols while a young native student holds a stack of Aztec books ready to go in the flames. The Spaniards believed that Aztec books recorded the voice of the devil, hence their desire to destroy these works. By eradicating Aztec books, the Spaniards were also trying to stifle Aztec sources of knowledge and power. And yet, the Aztec art of manuscript painting persisted into the colonial era, revealing the lasting power of books for the native peoples. Today, I'm offering an introduction to these Aztec codices, explaining their material form, pictorial system of writing, their varied contents, and their continued use after the Spanish conquest, where we see native responses to and engagement with European books. Though Aztec books are often referred to as codices, these were not the inflexible bound books typical in Europe. Instead, Mesoamerican books were made of long sheets of paper, either of deer hide or fiber made from the maguey or ficus tree, that were coated in gesso and then painted and folded accordion style. The Aztec or Nahuatl word for paper is amat and forms the root of the word for book, which is amoshli. Unlike European bound books that only reveal 2 pages at any one time, Aztec amoshli are often folded accordion style and can display any or all pages at once. Moreover, in Aztec screenfold manuscripts, one can fold the leaves so as to make comparisons between non-sequential imagery or to omit information not deemed necessary in a particular reading. The screenfold format then allows for maximum flexibility in use and enhances the interpretive potential of these manuscripts. Also enhancing their interpretive potential is their pictorial system of writing. In Aztec pictography, the bulk of information is recorded visually using standardized iconography and pictorial conventions. Specific information, such as the names of people and places, was conveyed through hieroglyphic compounds that made use of logograms that worked as either signs or syllables and effectively spelled a word with little ambiguity. Because this script functioned as a visual communication system, the viewer's ease of understanding an image was paramount. Thus, native artists strive for clarity, depicting the human body in twisted perspective with black outlines defining forms and framing areas of color, and making no attempt to show depth through modeling, shading, or illusion of space. This pictorial system blurred the boundaries between art and text and painting and writing. Though created after the conquest, the Codex Mendoza, painted in the Aztec capital around 1540, is a good example of this writing system and also allows me to provide you some history on the Aztec Empire. The book begins with an iconic image of the city's foundation. The blue signs that frame the page are years from the Aztec calendar. There are 4 Aztec year signs: house, rabbit, reed, and flint, that cycle through coefficients from 1 to 13. The coefficients are shown as discs and the signs are shown with standardized icons. So at the top is 2 house, the year of Tenochtitlan's foundation, or 1325 in our own calendar. The next year is 3 rabbit, then 4 reed, 5 flint, and so on. After 52 years, the cycle repeats. Tenochtitlan roughly translates as the place of the prickly pear cactus, and the cactus you see at the center of the page with an icon of a stone underneath acts as its place sign. In Nahuatl, the word for stone is tet, and so the stone here gives a te sound, and the cactus is nochli, so Tenochtitlan is phonetically approximated. The eagle at the top references a prophecy. The founders of Tenochtitlan were Mashika migrants who had left their original homeland of Aztlan in search of a new home, which their patron god told them would be revealed upon the sight of an eagle who had made a nest in a magnificent cactus tree. This iconic image should be familiar as it is now memorialized on Mexico's flag. Directly under the sign for Tenochtitlan is an image of a shield and arrows. This serves as a sign for war and suggests that the city was founded on this concept. Indeed, 2 conquests are shown below. Here, the icon for conquest is a burning temple with an overturned summit, and the place conquered is recorded behind this sign with a hieroglyphic compound that gives the name. This first place conquered is called Culhuacan, which roughly translates as the place of the curved hill. Accordingly, it is shown with a standardized icon of a hill with a curl at its top. A large-scale Mashika warrior holding a shield and club dominates a smaller victim from the city, further connoting conquest. The next few pages show the reigns and conquests of Mashika leaders. So this page is devoted to the Mashika ruler named Itzcoatl, or Obsidian Serpent. At the left is the timeline that records the years of Itzcoatl's reign. The ruler is pictured to the right, where we see a man seated on a woven reed throne. A small scroll issues from his mouth and conveys speech and also his rank. The Aztec title for rulers was Tlatoani, which translates as speaker. Also marking his rank is his turquoise crown. A hieroglyphic compound of an obsidian-encrusted serpent identifies the figure specifically as Itzcoatl, and he faces a shield over 3 spears, which again signifies war. Surrounding him are a series of temples with smoking, overturned summits, again communicating conquest. Each of the temples is marked with a hieroglyphic compound that phonetically names the place conquered. For example, second from the top is Coyoacan, or the place of the coyote. Thus, this page can be read in a relatively straightforward manner. The Codex Mendoza was commissioned by the Spanish Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza. After the conquest, Spanish friars had established schools to teach native students to read and write and to teach them about Christianity. Many of the students were already well-versed in Aztec pictorial writing. Mendoza went to one of these schools and had students there create this book, supplying them with European paper. Mendoza sought information on Aztec history, but he was also interested in learning about their economy and daily life, which are the next 2 sections of this manuscript. The manuscript is now owned by the Bodleian Library at Oxford University. Most likely it was intercepted by pirates on its journey back to Spain. Here we see the Codex Mendoza's tribute record. Again, much of the information can be read in a straightforward manner if one is aware of Aztec pictorial conventions. So hopefully you're now gaining enough familiarity with Aztec writing to realize that the series of hieroglyphic compounds along the left and bottom of the page are place names, and the items arranged to the right are tribute. The Aztecs had a few pictorial conventions for numbers. We've already seen discs, which can be used for numbers from 1 to 19. The number 20 was shown with a small banner, and the number 400 was shown with a feather. The items at the top of the page represent cloths, 2 of which are decorated and 2 plain. Each is topped with a feather, showing that these towns together had to supply 1,600 cloths to Tenochtitlan, and most likely this was about 4 times a year. Below this are warrior costumes and shields. The first set must be unique and quite valuable, as only 1 set was required. The other 2 sets are marked with banners, showing that these towns had to supply 20 of each set. 20 may not seem like a lot until you learn that these costumes and shields were made of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of woven feathers. Only 4 of these shields are known, but here are 2 to give you a sense of what they would have originally looked like. Below this in the manuscript are bushels of corn and beans, and then below this are bundles of stick for firewood and timber for building. And this is one of probably like 30 pages of tribute, so quite a lot was supplied to Tenochtitlan. The last section provides information on life in the Aztec world. It begins by showing a newborn Aztec child and indicating the rituals that accompanied birth. The next few pages shows how Aztec children were raised by age. On the right, we see little Aztec boys and girls being taught by their parents. The blue discs at the top of each register record age, so it starts with 3-year-olds at the top. The other discs you're seeing are tortillas and show how many tortillas each age was allowed to eat. And I hope this is at each meal and not per day, because the little 3-year-olds only get a half a tortilla each. Notice at 4 years, Aztec children were now allowed to eat 1 full tortilla, but they also started to learn chores based on gender, with boys being taught to fetch water, grass, and food, and girls being taught to weave. Later, we see punishments for naughty Aztec children. At the top, 11-year-olds are shown being held over chili pepper fires, which admittedly does seem a little harsh. Still later, we see a marriage ceremony on the right side, down below, with the bride and groom having their garments tied together. So they are literally tying the knot. Something to point out in this section is that we see more European influence in the style. Notice the folds and drapery on the clothing, whereas the earlier representation of Itzcoatl showed him with a flat mantle. There was no pre-conquest precedent for the information contained in the section on daily life. That is, the Aztecs had no need for a book about how life was lived, they just did it. So the painters used this section to experiment with the new, more illusionistic style of the Spaniards. I started with the Codex Mendoza because it's rather easy to understand. In contrast, the religious codices are much more complicated. These function on a more symbolic rather than narrative level and would have been read by highly knowledgeable calendar priests. Thus, these are filled with esoteric information, much of which eludes definitive interpretations. These codices are divinatory in nature, being used to forecast the fate of particular days based on their sacred associations. They are largely focused on the 260-day sacred calendar of the Aztecs and were called Tonalama, or Book of Days. This calendar, called Tonalpawali, or Count of Days, consists of 20 day names that cycle through coefficients from 1 to 13, as seen in the chart here. The days of the cycle with coefficients from 1 to 13 are known as trecenas and are kind of like our weeks. You can see that the calendar begins with alligator, which would receive the coefficient 1. Then the next day reading down is 2 wind, then 3 house, 4 lizard, etc. The first 13 days would be grouped as the 1 alligator trecena. Then the next group of 13 days starting at 1 jaguar would be known as the 1 jaguar trecena, and so on. There's actually a website that's quite useful. So if any of you are interested in looking yours up, it's just azteccalendar.com. And I ran today's numbers. And today is the Aztec day 5 flower, 5 soshi, and it's within the trecena called 1 vulture. So for the Aztecs, one's fate was tied to the sacred associations of one's birthday and trecena. So if you were to look this up, you'd really want to know what your birthday is. The days are inherently linked with the sacred realm, and the divinatory books explain the ways in which this is so through a wide variety of almanacs. For example, this almanac from the Codex Borgia shows the 20-day signs framing an image of back-to-back gods, whose accoutrements associate them respectively with death and life. The calendar sequence begins at the lower right corner with 1 alligator. Then reading to the left, you notice 12 dots, which indicate the next 12 days, at which time we arrive at 1 jaguar. And I admit this page is in poor condition at the corners, and that's likely because calendar priests were flipping the pages at the corners. So you get a real sense of the use of these documents. You would continue then back to the right and count another 12 days where you see 1 deer, and then back to the left where you see 1 flower, and so on, spanning the entire 260-day calendar. Thus, an interpreter of the page would use it in consultation with other almanacs to provide a reading for particular days and their supernatural associations, in this case, with the complementary forces of life and death. Probably one of the most dramatic and complicated renditions of the Aztec sacred calendar is shown on the first page of the Codex Borgia. It shows the entire 260-day calendar in a condensed form and as a cosmogram, revealing the layers of sacred associations of the sacred calendar, effectively showing the shape and sacred nature of Aztec time. The days are mapped onto a cross. So if we start at the top, and maybe you can see my little pointer right here, we see a tiny little alligator. So that's the start of the calendar, 1 alligator. Then 12 dots propel us up to jaguar for the 1 jaguar trecena. Then if we go left, we hit 1 deer, and then down 1 flower. We continue then reading in a counterclockwise manner, and we see the remaining days of the calendar fleshed onto this armature. They are associated with different directions, colors, gods, sacrificial implements, etc. So for example, 1 alligator shown at the top associated with the east and the color red. We also see a small temple here with an icon of the sun emerging from it. This is topped by a tree and a bird and 2 distinctive gods. At the center is the god of time itself, who brings everything into motion. And we could probably spend the entire hour just talking about this, but I'm going to move on. The 260 days of the calendar were also shown on individual pages arranged around the trecenas, or groups of 13. For example, this page from the Codex Borbonicus is devoted to the days of the 1 grass trecena. The 1 grass day sign is shown at the bottom left and associated with a god known as the flint knife god. Next, reading to the right, we see 2 reed, then 3 jaguar, etc., and each is associated with a different god. These gods are a group of 9 who reside over the nighttime hours and are known as the 9 lords of the night. So at 10 alligator, you can see that their sequence repeats with the flint knife god appearing again. Another sequence of gods is shown in the adjacent cells. These are the 13 gods that rule over the daytime hours. Each day also has a particular flying creature associated with it. So a person born on each day would carry these sacred associations. But those born under the Trecena as a whole also share sacred associations as recorded in the larger box. This particular Trecena is associated with a goddess called Mayowel. She is the goddess of maguey and is shown emerging out of a maguey cactus. Maguey was used to make an alcoholic beverage called pulque, and some of the icons that float on the page are associated with pulque, which is often shown with bubbles because it was a frothy alcoholic beverage. A Spanish annotation informs us that those born under this Trecena were destined to be borrachos, or drunkards. And my apologies if you looked up your birthday and it fell in this Trecena. As I mentioned, the vast majority of Aztec books were destroyed by the Spaniards. Indeed, no pre-conquest Aztec pictorial history survived. However, some Aztec communities did return to their traditional system of bookmaking after the conquest to record their histories and preserve their identities. One of these, known as the Tierra De Tapeshpond, is so native in style that if it didn't record history through the conquest, we might suppose it predated Spanish arrival. The manuscript is actually a long piece of bark paper that has been folded accordion style. A string of Aztec year signs runs through the manuscript, and we see two registers of history. The upper register records the history of the local community of Tapeshpond, and the lower register records the history of Tenochtitlan. So Tapeshpond was aligning its history with the capital of the Aztec Empire. This gives a nice sense of how history books would have looked in the pre-conquest past. It also shows how the contents of books could be manipulated to make political arguments. The histories of the two cities largely follow a similar trajectory. Both are shown as migrants into the Valley of Mexico, as we see here. Eventually, they found their own cities and established a ruling dynasty. Tellingly, the Tapeshpond historians show their own city's foundation, which is shown on the left, chronologically a number of years before the foundation of Tenochtitlan, suggesting that theirs was the more ancient city. Upon Spanish arrival, the Tapeshpond artists again highlight Tapeshpond over Tenochtitlan. I think it's telling that the arrival of the Spaniards is shown with a dove and cross, and it's not in excellent condition, but right there, above the year one reed. And this is shown on the upper Tapeshpond register, whereas on the lower Tenochtitlan register, we see an armed Hernan Cortez, which suggests that the people of Tapeshpond have peacefully accepted the Spaniards in their religion, while the people of Tenochtitlan had to be forcibly conquered. After the conquest, many native communities used pictorial histories both to remember their history and to prove their acceptance of the new Spanish ruling hierarchy and Christian religion in the hopes of gaining privileges. They also recorded hardships such as epidemics, with a smallpox victim shown above the two flint ear signs, so right here. This particular work was most likely commissioned by and maintained by the local community of Tapeshpond until an Italian antiquarian named Lorenzo Boccherini acquired it. He was traveling through Mexico in the mid-18th century and collecting ancient manuscripts in order to write a history of Mexico. His work attracted the attention and suspicion of the Mexican government, who imprisoned Boccherini and confiscated his collection, which eventually became dispersed and reacquired by French collectors who left the manuscripts to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, where they remain today. Another Aztec book in the collection of the Bibliothèque Nationale is rather anomalous, as it reveals a great deal of European influence and seemingly miscellaneous contents. It was also the subject of a book I published a few years ago, as mentioned by Kevin. I thought I'd close my presentation by focusing a bit on this book in more detail. Here it is. Created by a group of native intellectuals working in Mexico City, which became the capital of New Spain and was formerly Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. The Codex Mexicanus is an Aztec pictorial manuscript created around 1580 or 60 years after the Spanish invasion and conquest of Mexico. The Codex is a bound book of over 100 bark paper pages, 2 of which I show you here. Its dimensions are rather small, about half the size of a standard piece of paper, and I suspect this was intentional, making the book easy to hide in one's pocket, as its contents might have aroused the suspicions of the Spanish colonizers. The Codex is admittedly not as beautifully painted as some of the other works I've shown you today, and its contents seem miscellaneous. They include records pertaining to calendars and religion, medicine and health, and genealogy and history, the majority of which were recorded using the traditional Aztec pictorial system of writing. Though the contents seem random, they actually find counterparts in Spanish books called Repertorios de los Tiempos. These books are similar to almanacs and contain vast assortments of apparently miscellaneous information, much like the Codex Mexicanus. Repertorios were used as guides to living in early modern Spain, so likewise, the Codex Mexicanus must have provided its native audience a guide to living in colonial New Spain. Additionally, the Spanish almanacs communicate an identity for Spain as a modern Christian nation built upon an illustrious, though pagan, Roman past. The Mexicanus communicates a similar identity for New Spain, also a modern Christian nation built upon an illustrious, though pagan past, and now an Aztec one. But why record this information using the Aztec pictorial system of writing rather than the newly introduced European alphabetic writing system? Based on some of the context of the contents of the Mexicanus, such as the saint's calendar I'm showing you here, the compilers of the manuscript had to have been familiar with European alphabetic writing, making the use of pictorial script intentional, which I believe speaks to native beliefs about knowledge and the legitimacy and value of their visual system of communication over an alphabetic one. In fact, the distinction between art and writing that we may see as natural is not true of all cultures. For example, the Aztecs did not distinguish between art and writing. In Nahuatl, the verb tlacuilolitzli encompasses the categories of painting, drawing, and sculpting, and writing. And the word tlacuilo references both an artist and a scribe. Nevertheless, many Europeans did not consider the pictorial writings of the indigenous peoples to be a true writing system, and because of this, argue that the Aztecs were not civilized. This argument is best seen in judicial debates held in Spain a few decades after the conquest about the rationality of the native peoples. Arguing against native rationality, one of the Spanish jurists maintained that the indigents were, and I quote them, barbarians, a people in whom you will scarcely find traces of humanity, who not only lack culture, but do not even know how to write, who keep no records of their history except certain obscure and vague reminiscences of some things put down in certain pictures, end quote. And yet many Aztecs, who were surely cognizant of the privileging of alphabetic writing by Europeans, continued to use their own visual knowledge system through which they were able to record many complex topics. Indeed, the contents of the Codex show that its creators must have been educated in the Spanish system, making their choice of pictorial script intentional. Page 9 of the Codex situates the book's creators in a specific school. Written in Nahuatl, an annotation at the top of the page mentions the arrival of Spanish or Augustinian friars at San Pablo. This references the establishment of a school in the native barrio of San Pablo in Mexico City in 1575. A calendar wheel at the center of the page is marked with the year 1575, which confirms that the annotation references this school. It was established by an Augustinian friar named Alonso de la Vera Cruz, who is known for his defense of the rationality of the native peoples. The annotation and educated nature of the Mexicanus creators points to them having a connection to this school and access to a Christian education there. Other clues within the work place the creation in 1580, which was soon after the school was founded. This was a particularly turbulent moment for New Spain. Epidemics had just ravaged the native populations, as reported in the Annals section of the manuscript, with a skull above the year 6.7 house, or 1576-77, and the word kokolitzli, the Nahuatl word for sickness, written below and referencing a brutal hemorrhagic fever that killed over 50% of the native population. The repercussions of this outbreak were immediately felt as native communities devastated by the epidemic were still expected to pay tribute to the Spanish crown. The church too was marked by growing tensions at this time, with the Spanish crown attempting to limit the power of the friars who had worked so closely with the native populations. This tense atmosphere must have sparked a desire on the part of a group of educated Nahuas to create this particular book with its carefully chosen contents. Though the identities of the actual contributors to the Codex are unknown, one page towards the end of the book suggests they had fully embraced Christianity. Here we see a winding road that connects two images with biblical references. A figure stands to the right and holds his hands together in prayer. His cloak communicates his native identity, but his pants and short hair show that he lives as a Christian. 12 eyes, which are drawn in a schematized manner, record sight and extend before him. The eyes communicate a vision received by this native convert and pictured at the upper left, where Christ stands before a forest and communicates with the devil. Satan's representation is based on European precedent, that we hold stones that are Aztec in appearance. So these are the icons for stones that frequently appear in Aztec art. And we saw earlier at the bottom of the place sign for Tenochtitlan. The image references the temptation of Christ, with Satan taunting a famished Christ to turn stones into bread. The fact that a native convert received such a vision is significant, for it shows them as true Christians, and at a time when many Spaniards were questioning the success of the conversion of the Aztecs. And I feel like the Aztec stones also place this in New Spain. This focus on Christianity is also found at the beginning of the Mexicanos, which starts with a monthly calendar. In this example for September, we see that it is associated with the zodiac sign for Libra, seen at the left. Then to the right, the 30 days of the month are indicated with a series of letters enclosed in circles. These are known as Dominical letters and refer to a sequence of letters from A to G that stand for the 7 days of the week. Another series of letters floats below these and records the 27-day cycle of the moon. The days of September further correlated with Christian holy days on the top and Aztec sacred festivals on the bottom. The Christian holy days are recorded in a variety of pictorial ways. The first, the Nativity of Mary, is shown with an image of Mary above a stream of water, which ends with the face of an old man. In the Nahuatl language, the water and old man approximate the sound Ave, which combined with Mary gives us Ave Maria or Ave Maria. A week later, the Feast of the Holy Cross is shown with a brick wall and a stone. In Nahuatl, these icons approximate the sound Shante, and when combined with a cross, give us Shante Cruz or Santa Cruz. Immediately following this is an alphabetic text referencing the September Ember Days. And then a few days later, we see a fish that marks a day of vigil when Catholics could consume fish but not meat. More saints' days complete the month. While revealing an interest in Christianity, the translation of Spanish saints' names and holy days into Aztec pictorial script also acts as a counterpoint to the assertion mentioned earlier that the Aztecs did not have writing and were not civilized. Although in poor condition, the lower register features yet another calendric sequence, this time referencing Aztec means of keeping time. Below September 12th, a grass broom records the start of the Aztec month called Ochpanitzli, which means the sweeping of the way, while a sign of 12 dots and a flint knife give the Aztec calendar date of 12 flint for the day on which this month began in a particular year. Thus, the Aztec sacred days are correlated with the Christian month and visually equated with Catholic saints' days. Monthly calendars with similar information are included in the Spanish repertorios. September begins with a print of the scales for Libra and the month's labors, followed by the days of the month, their Dominical letters, holy days, and lunar cycle. Just as the Christian calendar of Spain was built on the ancient Roman calendar, the Christian calendar of New Spain is shown here with an Aztec foundation, suggesting another equivalence between the ancient Roman and Aztec empires. Following the calendar is an intriguing 3-page section. Despite its poor condition, the section clearly pertains to European medical astrology. In the 16th century, it was believed that one had to have knowledge of astrology in order to know when to perform medical cures, such as bleeding and purging. A table that would have been used to determine the position of the moon in the zodiac on any given day is recorded on the first page of this section. Composed with a vertical orientation, the table includes a column at the left, with each sign of the zodiac, although I know you can barely make it out, it's not in the best condition. And these are associated with a disc colored red, black, white, or a combination of the two. At the top of the column are the 19 golden numbers, while the 27-letter sequence for the cycle of the moon fills the squares of the chart. Charts such as this served a medical function, being used in consultation with the monthly calendar. So if I use today as an example, if we look at the month of August, we see that the lunar letter for August 16th is D, and the golden number for that is for 2021 is 8. So you calculate that by dividing the year by 19 and adding 1 to the remainder. So following the 8 row down to lunar letter D and working our way left, we see that today the moon is in Aquarius. As seen here, this page has a corollary to information found in the Spanish repertorios, where we see a similar golden number chart that is followed by another chart that correlates the moon being in one of these signs on a particular day as a time that is good, bad, or indifferent for purging and bleeding, common medical practices in Europe at this time. The Mexicanos' association of zodiac signs with circles on the golden number chart acts as a shorthand device to record similar information on a particular day's suitability or lack thereof for these same medical procedures. Recalling that the moon today is in Aquarius, it would be malo, or bad day for purging, but a good one for bleeding. So if anyone is feeling under the weather today, you might keep that in mind. And also I may have made that look easy, but I should admit it took me months to figure out what was going on these pages. So this is not common knowledge today, although I do have a fantasy that this will, that this will show up on Goop someday. So here's my Goop slide. So someday I'll be ready for when that becomes a thing. The golden number chart is followed by another zodiacal chart associated with medical practices. Here, the 12 signs of the zodiac are coupled with the same sequence of colored discs, along with an icon referencing one of the 4 elements. In European medical astrology, the zodiac signs and their elements were associated with the humors, that is, bodily functions and behaviors. So this page continues the medical focus. Continuing with the medical theme is the image on the next page, which is known as a zodiac man, which is based on the belief that each sign of the zodiac influenced the part of the body with which it was associated. This anonymous repertorio includes a zodiac man that is similar to that included in the Mexicanos, which hopefully you can see despite its poor condition. Clearly, the issue of health was an area of concern for the contributors to the Mexicanos, and the interest in European medicine suggests that they were specifically concerned with the diseases introduced by the Europeans. This makes sense considering that epidemics had devastated the native populations just before the Mexicanos was compiled. Moreover, the poor condition of this section in particular reveals to me that these pages were frequently consulted by the book's owners, surely because European diseases continue to devastate native peoples long after the book's creation, a situation with which we can all sympathize today. The focus on time gives way to more historical matters, beginning with a genealogy of the Tenochka royal house. The first page of the genealogy begins with the divine ancestors of the future Mashika Imperial leaders and links them to the founders of Tenochtitlan, which is shown on the next page, along with the subsequent establishment of its royal dynasty. Tenochtitlan's first ruler, Akamapichli, or handful of arrows, is shown at left with 2 wives, one above and one below. And then from them, the generations echo out into increasingly higher numbers, ending at the far right with a generation that would have lived in the 1560s, showing the continuity of this family line. I won't try your patience by identifying all the faculty members here and direct you to my book if you'd like to learn more about that. The annals history that follows the genealogy takes up the majority of the manuscript. And here again, time is a key organizing element, as historic events are linked to an Aztec timeline that runs the length of the section. much like the other history I showed you. The history is extensive, so I'll just give you a few highlights. It begins where most Aztec histories do, with the start of the Mashika Migration. In the distant past, the Mashika were said to have lived on an island called Aslan, located somewhere to the north, which some believe was in northern Mexico, and some even argue may have been in California. Knowing the Mashika were destined for greatness, their patron god ordered them to leave and go in search of a new homeland. Here we see the patron god, Huitzilopochtli, who's perched in a tree, though he's cut off a bit by the top of the page. He orders his people forward, and they must cross water in order to step up onto a timeline and start both time and history. This account of migrants crossing a body of water calls to mind the story of Exodus. Others, including Spanish friars, noted the similarity, and it's likely that the native historians emphasize this parallel between Mashika and Christian history. The migration takes up a large portion of the annals history and consists of the Mashika migrants moving from place to place, each of which is identified with a hieroglyphic compound. The one I highlight here is the place of the skull rack. The alphabetic sources relate that the Mashika took one of their first captives here, and after sacrificing him, erected a skull rack on which his decapitated head was displayed. Such a rack was actually recently discovered in Mexico City by archaeologists, and they found about 3,000 skulls embedded on the rack so far. After the foundation of Tenochtitlan, another key event that many sources emphasize was the renovation and dedication of the Great Temple, which the Mexicanos also includes. However, the Mexicanos differs from other pictorial histories by emphasizing a string of natural disasters just after the dedication. So if we flip the page, we see an earthquake, which is recorded with an X-shaped sign that records movement or earthquakes in Aztec pictorial script. Then in the next year, there was a hailstorm that killed fish, then a plague of locusts, and an eclipse. A few years later on the next page, there was another earthquake, and a gash of water records a massive flood in another year. Elsewhere in the Codex, there are other natural disasters, but it's intriguing that so many are clustered just after the wealth of gifts, including sacrificial victims, that would have been given to their patron god during his temple dedication. And I'll return to this in a bit. The climax of the imperial history is certainly the arrival of the Spaniards in one reed, or 1519, but the painter shows Cortez on the previous page. First, we see a Spanish ship that was first noticed by natives along the coast. Then a Mashika envoy is shown with a head bowed before a seated Cortez. The items shown on these pages reference a gift exchange, suggesting a diplomatic meeting of equals. However, the military conquest is also referenced. A Spanish conquistador stands on the register above one reed, then a smoking temple above two flint shows the destruction of the Great Temple. A small figure covered in pockmarks shows that smallpox arrived with the Spaniards and devastated the native peoples with no immunity to the disease. In poor condition on the lower register, a funerary bundle pierced with an arrow records the death of Motec Busoma, and next to this is the inauguration of his successor, Cuauhtemoc. The icon above three house of Spanish swords under a shield, along with an armor helmet, marks the Spanish conquest over Tenochtitlan in 1521. By Four Rabbit, we see Cortez consolidating rule. Here he speaks with three native men, one of whom is the Mexica ruler Cuauhtemoc. The fire between them suggests Cortez's well-known torture of Cuauhtemoc to learn where the Mexica had hidden their gold. Time doesn't allow me to read the entire history, but the manuscript includes events like the arrivals of Spanish religious and political personnel, conquests, native ruler inaugurations, natural disasters such as earthquakes, and epidemics, which were a new and recurring feature of life for the native peoples. Genealogies and histories were surely recorded in pre-conquest Aztec books, but they were also recorded in Spanish almanacs. In fact, the Mexicanos anticipates a repertorio written by Enrico Martinez and published in New Spain in 1606, created with the intent of serving those living in New Spain. Accordingly, Martinez included sections on the Mashika calendar and history, suggesting that he too saw an equivalency between Spain and New Spain. Together, the Martinez repertorio and the Mexicanos suggest a sense by both natives and Europeans that knowledge of the Aztec past was necessary to understand New Spain. Moreover, their conquest by the Spaniards opened a new chapter in Mexica history, one in which their capital of Tenochtitlan was transformed into New Spain. Though still recorded in the Aztec pictorial system of writing, the annals history transformed from an Aztec one to a Spanish one. From the Spanish perspective, the conquest and evangelization of the New World fulfill Christian history. And from an Aztec Christian perspective, it must have been a part of God's plan intended to bring them to Christianity. Thus, the contributors to the Mexicanos would have looked to their own past to make sense of their place in Christianity. In this regard, Rome would have been a useful model. Both Rome and Tenochtitlan were once capitals of pagan empires that became transformed into Christian capitals. In fact, I suspect that St. Augustine, who wrote about the city of God, would have had special resonance for Aztec Christians, especially those living in the 16th century, when the conquest was fading into historical memory and when the colony was reeling from epidemics and natural disasters. In his book, St. Augustine offered a model to make sense of Tenochtitlan. His work was written in the 5th century, soon after the sack of Rome, when Romans were wondering if they were being punished by their pagan gods for accepting Christianity. This is echoed in Tenochtitlan's destruction during the conquest, and the calamities that befell the Romans were surely comparable to the devastations experienced by the Aztecs, especially the massive epidemic. It would only have been logical for them to question if these devastations were brought by their Aztec gods as punishment for accepting Christianity. St. Augustine's argument is that no matter how devastated a city might be, the city of God would be eternal. The proofs brought forth by St. Augustine find resonance in the pre-conquest history, and I think they clarify that focus on natural disasters just after the dedication of the temple. St. Augustine used disasters as proof of the inefficacy of the ancient gods. And I think the Mexicanos inclusion of all these disasters shows that the Aztec gods were also unable to avert these. The Mexicanos may also explain the suffering of present-day Christians, which is also emphasized in the colonial history and which St. Augustine linked with salvation. Indeed, native Christians cannot help but correlate increased suffering and death with the arrival of the Spaniards and Christianity. Keep in mind, there were no epidemics before Spanish arrival, so no smallpox, typhus, or hemorrhagic fever. This idea of suffering calls to mind that miraculous vision. Here, the suffering of Christ witnessed by the native convert mimics the devastations endured by the indigenous Christians, and the message may be that if they can be like Christ and avoid the temptation of the pagan gods, they will find salvation in the afterlife. Putting this all together reveals that the Mexicanos must have been an important book for its owners, not a random assortment of miscellanea, but information essential to know and remember for the descendants of the Mexica living in colonial New Spain. Moreover, its use of pictorial writing to record complex information related to religion, history, and health reveals the strength of the Aztec visual communication system and the significance of books for the Aztecs both before and after the conquest. It makes a compelling argument for Spaniards who privileged writing over art. In fact, echoes of this privileging of writing over art still reverberate today, which results in a diminishing of the intellect of Native American peoples. For example, if I switch gears to the present day, I've always liked emojis because they remind me of Aztec icons and pictorial script. And I think they show the value of visual discourse. But some see them differently. So an article I pulled from CNBC asked if emojis are the death of the written language and regression back to the age of hieroglyphic writing. And another in The Guardian states that emojis are not progress, but a step back. That's why Greece rather than Egypt leapt forward and why Shakespeare was more articulate than the Aztecs. So despite that statement, I think these emojis nicely articulate how I felt reading this. And of course, that last one is my own made up Aztec emoji. Clearly, there are those who subscribe to the inherent superiority of alphabetic writing and accordingly Western culture, but the Aztecs who lived after the Spanish arrival and imposition of alphabetic writing clearly continue to link knowledge with their pictorial system of writing. Ultimately, the Western inclination to not adequately acknowledge the value of the visual sphere in recording and disseminating knowledge, thoughts, aesthetic, etc., perpetuates the debate about the intelligence, rationality, and humanity of non-Western peoples. As I hope I've shown, the Aztec books provide a compelling argument against such beliefs. Thank you. And I'll do a little plug of my books here at the end.
Great. I'm going to come back on. Leave that slide up because people are going to be asking about your books and what they're titled and all of that great detail. And we'll be definitely sending out in the email tomorrow to everyone who's here links for all of these. So if you don't get to write them down, don't worry. You'll get an email that explains them all and tells you how you can find out more about Lori and about those 3 books that are on the screen there. And we do have some time at the top of the hour, which is great because I have a couple pages of notes here, and there are a couple of questions in the chat and the Q&A that I want to share with you. But before I do that, I got to say that thank you, because that was an incredible presentation. I mean, that was such you packed so much into an amazing crash course in the whole visual communication system of the Aztec Codices that it's a little overwhelming to kind of think about all of the details. And, like you said, it appears you could just look at it and interpret it, but it takes so much time, effort, and energy to get into all of those details. And the Codex Mexicanus, that is incredible. There's so much in there. And I think one of the questions, I mean, we could talk about what's in there and how it was used. You covered a lot of that. But I think people are interested to know who created them? Who were the people who actually made the codices? How they made them? The book as an object, and we know that it's bark in some cases, inks they made. Can you tell us a little bit about the materials that make up the codices first?
Yeah, so it would have been, a pretty multifaceted process to create the books. The people who would paint the books would have been elite members, probably of the Aztec court. So the more children Aztec rulers were having, the more jobs they needed to give them. So they would have been occupied by writing the histories, the tribute books. The Aztec society, the empire, was very bureaucratic. There were schools that Aztec children would go to. So that page from the Codex Mendoza I showed, right when the child is born, they were sort of given to different schools. So elite children would go to more elite schools where they would learn to read and write, to paint these manuscripts. The divinatory manuscripts I talked about were read by really knowledgeable calendar priests. And I think those are more intentionally difficult to understand because, you have to keep your customers coming to you, and it's esoteric knowledge that a certain elite class needs to essentially control. So that's why I think those are a lot more complicated. The Aztecs had markets, and I would imagine inks were sold at markets. So for the schools, so as I was saying, it is very bureaucratic. I didn't show you, but in the Codex Mendoza tribute document, paper was one of the items of tribute that would have been given to the empire. So lots of paper. I don't have the exact number, but I want to say something crazy, like 80,000 sheets of paper. And also I made it sound like they were only writing on paper, but they also wrote on cloths, I should say. And some of them are larger map-sized pieces that might go on walls, so mimicking mural paintings.
Interesting. So there, more on that kind of that same subject. So was pictorial literacy only available to privileged classes, or was mostly illiterate society and just hierarchy was able
yes,
to?
I think it exists on multiple levels. So I think most of the pictorial histories, you can understand what's being shown. And I would argue those 2 sculptures I started out with, like the Aztec Calendar stone, I would argue that could be read by most people, that it's like a pictorial script on a sculpture, and that most people would know what those icons are referencing. So it's like the icons themselves have associations of meaning, and most people would get a basic understanding, but then to dig deeper, like in the histories, to kind of give the who, the what, and the why, I think that's where the trained elites would come in, and they might, some argue that they might perform the histories, sing and dance about them, that they'd be like mnemonic records that kind of give chains of meaning. So I think at a basic level, most people can understand that. And I should also say, for the tribute document, the Aztec Empire was a multilingual empire, so the visuals could be understood not dependent on language. So you don't need to read it. You could still understand how much tribute you needed to give if you didn't speak Nahuatl. So I think there's levels of meaning where the most elite people would be able to read those divinatory codices and trained calendar priests would. A regular Aztec person, I don't think they could pick up the calendar book and fully read it. In fact, I wouldn't say scholars today can fully read it. We still, are piecing together what those showed.
So there's a question about because you said paper a couple of times, and now you said cloth, so we know that that's another element. So was the paper really like bark, tree bark and animal skins? Like how did they make paper in the way that paper is made now?
It's the bark paper. I mean, yeah, I think societies came to similar ways of making the paper. So the Aztecs went to like the ficus tree, bark made from there, or sometimes from maguey, and often it depended where you were and what the manuscript was being used for. So my sense is that the deerskin ones are more elite, fancy manuscripts, and the bark paper ones maybe are a little bit, I don't want to dismiss any of them because I think they're all valuable.
Right.
Perhaps a bit more provincial. And so I think there's levels, and it's very similar to like medieval bookmaking in Europe, I think, as well, where like vellum takes a lot of work to create. So you would save that for the most illustrious books.
Right. And for the special customers. So speaking of customers, right? So books were made and then people acquired these. How were they sold? Were they traded? Like, how did they come into people's possessions? And clearly the priests got them, however they got them.
Yeah, and so, I wouldn't say people. I would say Aztec rulers and priests. So I think like temples would own them. I do think there was probably in the way I imagine Aztec people living, I think there was Aztec calendar priests who kind of set up shop. And when a child was born, the parents would go to the priest and he would bring out his book and you would tell him what day the child was born on, and he would provide a reading of your days. So they were accessible to those priests. I should also mention the Aztecs gave you 4 days to introduce your child to the sun, which set their fate. So if you were born on a really bad day, or if your child was, you could wait to do the ceremonies so that they got a better day. So there is a little bit of maneuvering one can do with these books and their fates. The histories and the tribute documents would have been owned and controlled by the rulers. So there's some accounts of the Spaniards, for example, targeting the archives of the rulers, like burning down the archives to burn all these books. So that's why there must have been, as I said, like hundreds, if not thousands of these books, and so few survive. And so the fact that no histories survive suggests to me that they went to the royal archives and burned the books. So Tenochtitlan would have had some, all the other cities, like Tapeshpond itself, it's a very minor city. We probably wouldn't even really necessarily talk about it much, but the fact that they created that book suggests that even minor cities would have kept their histories. And again, the fact that so few of them survive shows that the Spaniards were actively targeting those.
Yeah, that's crazy. Because like you said, so many would have been made in different cities, and so few still like exist now.
Yeah.
So okay, go ahead.
I was going to say, and then the ones that do survive, the divinatory ones are, were probably sent back as items of curiosity by the conquerors. There's a group of manuscripts that do survive, I should say, histories do survive from the Mixtec area. So these are a little bit different from the Aztec manuscripts, but some of those pre-conquest ones did survive, probably because they were outside of that main conquest zone from the beginning and were able to hide them and preserve them. But that's only like half a dozen of those have survived. So I shouldn't say no pre-conquest histories survive. Mixtec ones do survive, and that's from like the Oaxaca area.
So a clarifying question: were the codices in different languages, or were they all in one language? And
Yeah, and that's a great question, because again, they're not necessary. I mean, on the one hand,
It's not in the language.
It's not tied to language, but on the other hand, you kind of need to know the language to dig deeper into some of the meanings.
Right.
So like the Mixtec ones, you have to know the Mixtec language. They're known as the Nutzawi people. And so you need to know that language to kind of piece together some of what you're seeing. But again, I don't think for the most part, those are that language dependent. I think it helps, but I wouldn't necessarily say they're language dependent. In fact, I should say some of the manuscript I showed, the divinatory ones, it's still argued if those are from cities under the Aztec Empire or if they might be Mixtec themselves, like if they might be used by people who spoke a different language.
Interesting. We're about 5 or 6 minutes past the hour. We're not going to get to all of these questions. So folks out there, if you have questions, we are probably not going to get to all of them, but I will share all of them with Lori, and you can even answer some of them back to me later, and I can get back to folks. Some of them are very specific, but I wanted to give you a chance to tell us how you did all of your research for these books. And did you travel? Because these codices are all over the world. To do the research? Did you actually go to some of these places and handle them or see them, or tell us about that?
Yeah, so the Tierra De Tapeshpond started as my dissertation project, and I went to Tapeshpond just to kind of in Mexico to be there. But unfortunately, it's not owned by the local community anymore. So, unfortunately, I had to go to Paris, who owns the manuscript. And I also went to archives in Seville, Spain, because for that particular manuscript, I was curious about why exactly they decided to create it. So I suspected there might be a lawsuit that they needed to assert their status for. So that's where I had to travel for that one. And then while I was doing that research, as you mentioned, I have an interest in how women are shown in these manuscripts, and the Mexicanas has a genealogy in it. So I was curious about how women appear in that genealogy, but they rarely appear actually in the histories themselves. And that led me to kind of question this manuscript itself, because when I saw it in person, it's so tiny, and I think everybody kind of ignores it. And I just felt like it had so much to tell. And so I just wanted to work on it. And that took, quite a number of years. And also just piecing together, as I mentioned, that medical astrology section.
Oh, yeah.
I had no idea what that was. And then I finally found that, the repertorio, and that kind of unlocked a lot of what's going on there. And for that one too, it's in Paris. So I had to, I started and ended in Paris. Like, you don't know what the first time you see it. You always have to go back and look at these a lot. And then digital images really help these days.
So I should have asked this question first. What inspired you to start researching this and make it your thesis project and all that kind of stuff? Like, what was the inspiration?
It's funny because I clicked on the chat and I see somebody who I'm a huge fan of, an artist, Enrique Chagoya. I noticed he asked a question about Elizabeth Hill Boone, and she was actually my professor at Tulane. So I went to Tulane, interested in Mesoamerican art generally, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to do the Aztecs or the Maya. And Elizabeth Boone came to Tulane, and, I just became fascinated by the Aztecs, especially the moment of conquest. And this might be why I like Enrique Chagoya's work so much, is that coming together of East and non-Western and Western, or however we want to call it. And I just find it so fascinating that the Nahua peoples continue to go back to their traditional system of writing in the face of the Spaniards denigrating that system in a way and saying, it's not true writing. And that they use this to, negotiate their status within the Spanish Empire. So I think that's what's been compelling a lot of my research, is that moment of contact between two such different cultures, and how both cultures modified what they were doing to learn about the other. Because at the same time, the manuscripts I focused on here were created by Native communities, the books for themselves, whereas something like the Codex Mendoza was created for the Spaniards to learn about the natives. So I think the patron of the manuscript is also quite interesting. So I think I'm more drawn to the ones that the local community itself felt the necessity to write these records. And that's what I'm really interested in. I mean,
Yeah.
the other ones are fascinating too, because they're
Sure.
directly speaking to the Spaniards. But the Mexicanas, I suspect, when it was being created, there's another Aztec manuscript known as the Florentine Codex, which is probably one of the most famous. It's in Florence right now. That was confiscated by the Spaniards. So if they had seen something like this little manuscript in the hands of the native peoples, I suspect they would have taken it away, which again reveals that this must have been quite important to the native peoples to write down. So that fascinates me. People working under oppression, essentially.
Well, I mean, speaking of the confiscation and Enrique's question, he's got it in both the chat and the Q&A.
Oh.
So I don't know if you saw the second part of that. He asks about the destruction of the Aztec libraries. And I think somebody else asked about that as well. Do you want to comment on? Yeah.
What I was referring to before. So yeah, I'm not, I mean, definitely it happened because we don't have books. And you hear, just when you read the accounts of it, it just talks about the crying and the horror of that. And I think that image I showed earlier, to me, like that fire and everything, like all the icons floating out of it, speaks to the horror of that event. So I think, you know, we talk obviously about, you know, the epidemics, the violence, but to me, the Spaniards targeted systems of knowledge. And I think that was one of the ways in which they could, you know, colonize these people. And we don't, I don't know if we think about that enough, that they're specifically targeting, you know, art, essentially, because art is what communicates history and religion, especially in the Aztec world.
They knew exactly what they were doing, right? And why they were doing it. And
I should say I'm blaming the Spaniards, and you know, but I should qualify, the Spaniards had a lot of native allies. So the Mashika had a lot of enemies, and they were happy, you know, to destroy the Mashika as well. So it wasn't just 400 Spaniards. It was really more of a civil war against the Mashika.
So there's other questions. They're going to be sent to you, and we can talk about some of them. But I do want to ask this last one, which I think is quite interesting. Have there been any efforts to return any of these to the native land, right, to Mexico from wherever they might be held, because they're held all over the place?
Yes. There was an incident a number of years ago where one of the manuscripts that is in the National Library of France was taken and returned, the French would say illegally, and returned to Mexico. And there was a big, you know, fight between France and Mexico to get it back, and Mexico refuses to give it back. It's owned, I think it's now in the National Library of Mexico. It's known as the, well, I might be saying the wrong title. So it's a divinatory manuscript, though. It's one that's on a single piece of paper, so it was kind of easier to take. And I will say one of my annoyances, you know, if I might admit that, with the Bibliothèque Nationale, is they have these amazing manuscripts, but not really a specialist who focuses on them and works on them. Mexico has asked for these back, and France is not giving them back. There was just, however, alphabetic document known as by an author named Chimal Payin, written by a native author, and it came on the market, and Mexico brought the money together to purchase it. So that was a really big thing, because, you know, they're able to bring their patrimony back to Mexico. And I will say Mexico owns quite a few of these, but I'm always, you know, not too pleased that they're in Paris, and not, I don't think, you know, they're not really accessible. I will say, if anybody's interested, Paris, the National Library does have a good website. And when I order photos of these images, they digitize them and put them online. So a lot of these now are online. When scholars order them, they then take that. Finally, they have a photographer. It takes time to photograph these. But they are becoming digitized more and more now, and more accessible that way.
Yeah, that's great, because they're so fascinating and interesting to look at, even with the little bit of knowledge that you've given us now. I'd like want to go look at them and try to, you know, figure stuff out. So some of them are in like you mentioned, pretty poor condition, right? Because they've been used and pages turned. How are they stored? How are they kept and maintained? Are they super fragile? Are people worried about how they're going to survive into the future?
Yeah, and I think that's why they are inaccessible, I will say. So sometimes they travel. There's a few manuscripts, I think the ones that are in the better condition, where you'll see them in exhibitions around the world, but rarely. So they're really kept, in dark conditions. I always joke once when I went to Paris to look at the Mexicanus itself in person, they came out and they were like, oh, we're having a problem. The key broke in the lock, so we can't open the case in which it's stored. So that's the only clue I get on how it's stored. They didn't let me into the storage room. And, so I was like, I'll come back tomorrow. And they said, we hope. And luckily somebody who was working there took pity on me and fixed it by the next day. But, they're really not accessed that frequently.
Yeah, that doesn't give me a lot of confidence in,
no.
in how they're being stored.
Me either. And I'm always surprised that, they don't make, you should wear gloves often in archives, but they don't always make you wear gloves. Kind of surprising how they're handled.
Yeah, well, hopefully they'll be around for further research and people will have access to them and they can be accessed digitally, which is great. But we're out of time. It's a little past 6:15. I could probably talk to you about this for hours. I know you actually said time does not allow for you to retell the entire history when you were looking at one of the codices, but I would totally be up for that. I would be interested in sitting down and listening to you tell me about every page and what is happening, because it is so fascinating. And I usually like to have a little quote from something that somebody has said during one of these presentations. And I love that you ended with emojis, that little emoji thing. That was great. But I think it was called the golden number chart that you talked about. And you said that today is a bad day for purging, but a good day for bleeding. So I think we should all just remember that as we wrap up this presentation today. Please remember, today is a bad day for purging, but it is a good day for bleeding. It was a great day to have you with us for this presentation. So thank you. Thank you so much for all of this. It was great. Do you want to say goodbye or thank you to anybody?
Oh, no, thank you, everybody. I'm so happy to talk about this with so many people. And feel free to email me if you have any questions. You can find me at TCU's website. So thank you all. You've been a great audience. I'm kind of looking at all these questions as I talk. So
there's lots of great comments. Superb talk, great slides. This was excellent. Little hand clap emoji came up. So great feedback. I loved it. Again, I would talk to you for hours about this, but we probably should let you go. You're a couple of hours ahead of us. It's dark there in the
dark
background.
as I spoke. I thought that was nice.
Yeah. So
thank you
again. Thanks again, Lori. This was great. And thank you everyone for attending this Book Club of California program. Please join us for our next online program titled Earthquake Hazard in the Southland, the Great Quake Debate. That's going to be on Monday, August 30th, 2 weeks from tonight, right? I think it's 2 Mondays from tonight, 5 to 6:15 p.m. here on Zoom. And it's going to be a live online presentation just like this one by Susan Howe, PhD, author, editor, and research seismologist. Wow, we haven't had that title on here before. Research seismologist talking about earthquake hazard in the Southland, the Great Quake Debate, Monday, August 30th. Please join us for that. You can register for that event but online at bccbooks.org/programs or using the link in the weekly programs emails that you're probably receiving from the book club. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you again, Lori. This was terrific. I'll follow up with you shortly, and hopefully we'll have you back in the future to do another talk for us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone, and have a great night.